The chambers process, as I think you will find, is common with many other chambers, is by way of two means of, or principally two means of assessment: application form and interview. Let me make an overarching comment, first of all, in relation to both applications and interviews. Chambers takes its responsibilities under the Bar Handbook, so for example, Core Duty 8, but also the Bar Qualification Manual and the Equality Act, extremely seriously. Interviewers and members of chambers who mark forms are all trained in fair recruitment and selection. It also means that so far as marking application forms is concerned, the process involves each form being double marked by two different members of chambers. And after that marking exercise has been undertaken, the two heads of pupillage, so myself and my colleague James, undertake a moderation exercise to compare marks, or if there are one of the two marks is substantially out. And I don't mind saying that the moderation exercise takes, as you might imagine, a substantial amount of time, and it's not unusual for James and I to have cause to look at a vast majority of the forms. The marking that we undertake is set against a defined set of criteria, and none of these, I suspect, will surprise you. We expect candidates to be able to display excellent intellectual ability, for example, and that can be determined by reference to matters such as the candidate's university degree, whether they have postgraduate qualifications, whether they've achieved scholarships, prizes, a previous career, or extensive writing, whether in articles or otherwise. We're looking for candidates who have excellent intellectual ability. In addition, of course, the job that we all do is in part public speaking. So one of the facets we look for are very good, excellent oral communication skills. And again, by way of examples, those might be demonstrated by effective public speaking, mooting, debating, acting as a successful advocate, voluntary work that's been undertaken as an advocate, for example, for the Free Representation Unit, and so on. Of course, we are also interested in why candidates are wanting to become barristers, and in particular, why apply to Guildhall chambers. We also look at, has a candidate demonstrated an interest in the particular area of law which is going to be covered by the relevant pupillage. So of course, in this case, that would be crime and personal injury and clinical negligence. We also, of course, look at written communication. We expect candidates to be able to demonstrate through their application form an excellent standard of written communication, which means, is the form well written? Are there any spelling mistakes? Are there silly errors or typos, and so on? Finally, we also have another category of scoring, which is to reflect candidates who have, for example, suffered exceptional hardship or an exceptional illness, or who have shown exceptional commitment or endeavour, which wouldn't probably be recognised in one of the scores available under the different categories. So standing back for a moment, you can see that there is quite an all-embracing list of factors which are taken into account in assessing application forms. It's probably important for me also to make clear at this point that everything that I have just said are examples which might, for example, demonstrate excellent written communication or excellent oral communication. The examples are not a closed list. And I know that we've had one question on the Zoom today: is it a hindrance not to have been able to do any mini pupillages for whatever reason that might be? To which the short answer is no, it's not. We don't have a system whereby the marker counts up the number of mini pupillages, and 10 mini pupillages equals a score of Y, and 15 equals a score of Z. It's simply not done that way. What we are more interested in is, can a candidate evidence an interest in becoming a barrister and an interest in the bar? As I indicated a moment ago, once those forms have all been scored by the two markers, they're then shortlisted by myself and by James to come up with a long list for interviews. And so let me move on to interviews now. There are, in a normal pupillage recruitment year, 2 rounds of interviews. The first round, I think you will find, is before a relatively small panel of members of chambers. Typically, that would be 2 members. And the first round interview takes the form of an advocacy exercise, and more often than not, that is a debate. So a candidate will propose or oppose a motion. If a candidate is successful at the first round of interview, they are then invited to a second round interview with a larger panel, typically 5 or more members of chambers. And the second round interview usually involves a combination of an advocacy exercise combined with some more general questions and biographical questions which arise out of a candidate's application form. To the extent it might be helpful for you, we're well advanced in our planning already for those interviews, and I can indicate the provisional dates for interviews. So provisionally, we envisage that our first round interviews will take place at some point during the week commencing the 22nd of March 2021. And so the idea there is to have our interviews before the Easter holidays. The second round interviews will take place in the week commencing 19th of April, which is just after Easter. And let me reassure you, we are aware that there are BPTC exams that week, and we intend to try and organise our interviews as much as possible around those so as to avoid clashes. In the case of both interviews, there is sufficient preparation time for you to read materials in chambers. There's a quiet area for you to prepare. Pens, paper, and so on are provided. We don't normally send out some materials in advance. It's more a case that you would arrive in chambers and collect the materials and prepare then. We don't pay expenses for first round interviews, save in exceptional circumstances if a candidate would not be able to travel for interview, but we do pay travel expenses in relation to round 2. That probably brings me relatively neatly to what you might say is the impact of COVID-19 and the current pandemic and the current lockdown on our interview process. You will have rightly noticed that everything I've described so far assumes what you might call a normal non-COVID interview process. Of course, we don't know what the situation is going to be in March and April this year, when I've outlined that we hope to conduct our interviews. It follows that we also don't know whether or not in-person interviews are going to be possible or not. So therefore, at this stage, our aim is to keep our options as open as possible, and we hope to be able to undertake interviews in person. But if that's not possible, then we also have the technology to undertake virtual interviews. Just by way of example, our interview process last year was delayed slightly in as much as March, the first lockdown started. So we conducted our interviews in the summer, at which point lockdown had been substantially released, and a number of students were, a number of applicants rather, were able to attend in person and participate in their interviews. However, some, for various reasons, were unable to participate in person. And so, of course, we made arrangements for them to be interviewed remotely by Microsoft Teams or Zoom or something like that. So I'm afraid I can't be more definitive than I've already been on that score. It's something to look out for in due course. And of course, we'll aim to communicate with applicants in as good time as possible. What I haven't really covered so far is what we look for in our interviews. And of course, we look for evidence of various matters. So, for example, in the advocacy exercises or in the debate, we look to see whether or not a candidate has identified the relevant factual issues, to the extent the advocacy exercise is a legal problem, the relevant legal issues, but also we're interested, of course, in a candidate's oral communication skills. Was the candidate able to present arguments logically? Were they engaging and articulate? Were they able to deal with challenges? So those are all matters which feed into our marking process for interviews. It's fair to say that on some occasions, we do run a third round interview. It's not our normal practice, but we have in the past, even in fact in last year's process, arrived at a situation where it was pretty much a dead heat between one or two or three candidates. And so in those circumstances, we ran a third round interview. So that is also possible. Now, the Pupillage Gateway timetable is obviously relatively compressed, but we've hopefully left ourselves enough time to mean that it may be that you're having a third round interview here at the end of April. We do also take up references, so please make sure in your application forms that the referee contact details are correct. And it's also worth bearing in mind that we also sometimes ask for examples of a candidate's written work. So again, it's useful to have given some thought to what pieces of work you've recently done might be useful in that regard.